Italy is beautiful. The architecture, the art, the food, the history. Rome, Florence, Venice, Milan, cities that represent the peak of human civilization. For centuries, Italy was where the world went to see what greatness looked like. But behind the Renaissance facades and the tourist attractions, behind the gelato shops and the Michelin-starred restaurants, Italy's economy is collapsing, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, structurally, and with a momentum that is now impossible to reverse. Italy carries a debt so large it can never be repaid. A banking system so fragile it could trigger a continental crisis. A demographic collapse so severe the country is literally disappearing. And a political system so dysfunctional that meaningful reform is mathematically impossible. Greece was a warning, a small economy that collapsed and required bailouts that nearly destroyed the euro. But Greece was only 2% of the eurozone economy, small enough to contain, painful but survivable. Italy is 15% of the eurozone, the third largest economy. Too big to bail out, too big to let fail, and too broken to fix. When Italy goes, and all the indicators suggest it's not a question of if, but when, the euro will face an existential crisis that no amount of European central bank intervention can solve. This is The Wealth Records, where every video will change how you see money, history, and the systems controlling your life. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what's happening to Italy right now is the script for how the entire European project ends. If you're Italian or living in Italy, do you feel this collapse happening around you? Drop a comment. We want to hear from people on the ground. To understand why Italy is the next disaster, you need to understand what makes Italy different from every other European crisis. Greece collapsed in 2010. Ireland, Portugal, Spain all faced severe recessions and required bailouts. But all of them were small enough that the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the IMF could step in, impose austerity, and force a painful adjustment. The cost was brutal. Greek pensioners saw their income cut by half. Spanish youth unemployment hit 50%. Irish families lost their homes. But the Eurozone survived because these economies were small. Containable. Italy is not containable. Italy's economy is larger than Spain and the Netherlands combined. It is the third largest economy in the Eurozone after Germany and France. And it is the 8th largest economy in the world. If Italy's debt becomes unpayable, if its banking system collapses, if its government defaults, there is no rescue package large enough to save it. The European Central Bank does not have the firepower. The European Union does not have the political will. And Germany, which has been the Eurozone's backstop for over a decade, is now facing its own industrial collapse and cannot afford to bail out Italy. That is what makes Italy different. And that is what makes the 4 ticking bombs inside Italy's economy so dangerous. Because when they explode, they will take the euro with them. Ticking bomb number 1, the debt trap. Italy's national debt exceeds 2.9 trillion. That is roughly 140% of Italy's annual GDP. Only Japan and Greece have higher debt to GDP ratios. And unlike Japan, which borrows almost entirely from its own citizens in its own currency, Italy borrows in euros, a currency it does not control. That is the trap. Italy cannot print euros to pay its debts. It cannot devalue the euro to make its economy more competitive. It is locked inside a monetary system designed for Germany's economy, not Italy's. And every year, Italy's debt grows. Not because Italian politicians are uniquely reckless, but because the Italian economy has not grown meaningfully in over 20 years. Italy's GDP today is roughly the same size it was in the year 2000, 25 years of stagnation. Meanwhile, debt has increased every single year, because even when GDP doesn't grow, governments still spend. Pensions must be paid, public employees must be paid, healthcare must be funded. And when tax revenues don't cover spending, the gap is filled with borrowing. Italy's government has not run a primary surplus, a budget surplus before interest payments, consistently enough to reduce the debt. And even when it does, the interest payments on the existing debt consume so much of the budget that total debt still rises. Italy now spends over $80 billion per year just on interest payments. That is nearly 10% of the entire government budget. Money that cannot be spent on infrastructure, education, or economic growth. Just interest, just servicing old promises. And it is getting worse. Because for over a decade, the European Central Bank kept interest rates at historic lows. Italy could borrow at rates close to zero. That era is over. Inflation has returned. The ECB has raised rates, and Italy's borrowing costs are rising. Every percentage point increase in interest rates adds billions to Italy's annual debt service. And when you are already spending 10% of your budget on interest, even small rate increases become catastrophic. Here is the trap Italy cannot escape. To reduce the debt, Italy needs economic growth. But Italy's economy is not growing. Why? Because Italy is locked in the euro and cannot devalue. Italian wages are too high relative to productivity. Italian labor laws make hiring and firing difficult. Italian regulations strangle businesses, and the euro keeps Italy's currency stronger than it would be if Italy still had the lira. In the past, when Italy faced this problem, it would devalue the lira. A cheaper lira made Italian exports competitive. It reduced real wages without cutting nominal salaries. It was painful, but it worked. The euro removed that option. Now, the only way for Italy to regain competitiveness is internal devaluation. Cutting wages, cutting pensions, cutting public spending, creating unemployment until costs fall enough for Italy to compete with Germany. But internal devaluation destroys economic growth, which means tax revenues fall, which means the deficit grows, which means the debt grows faster. Italy is in a debt trap with no escape. It cannot grow fast enough to outrun the debt. It cannot cut spending enough without collapsing the economy. And it cannot devalue because it is locked in the euro. The mathematics are unsolvable, and the markets know it. Ticking bomb number 2, the banking time bomb. Italy's second bomb is its banking system, and it is more dangerous than most people realize. Italian banks are sitting on over $200 billion in non-performing loans. Loans that borrowers are not repaying. Mortgages in default. Business loans to companies that no longer exist. Debts that will never be recovered. These loans are still on the bank's balance sheets, valued as if they were assets. But they are not assets. They are losses waiting to be recognized. And when those losses are finally recognized, Italian banks will need to be recapitalized, which means either private investors step in, which is unlikely, or the Italian government steps in, which it cannot afford, or the European Central Bank steps in, which creates a political crisis. Italy's banking problems are not new. Monte dei Paschi di Siena, the world's oldest bank, founded in 1472, collapsed in 2016. It required multiple government bailouts to survive. And it is still not healthy. Banca Carige collapsed in 2019. Banco Popolare and Banca Popolare di Vicenza both failed and were absorbed in emergency rescues. The pattern is clear. Italian banks are not recovering. They are being kept alive by government life support and ECB liquidity. But that cannot last forever. Because Italian banks are not just carrying bad loans from the last crisis, they are exposed to the next one. Italian banks hold enormous amounts of Italian government debt, over $400 billion worth. Why? Because Italian government bonds, despite the risk, are treated under EU banking rules as risk-free assets. Banks can hold unlimited quantities without needing additional capital. This creates a deadly feedback loop. Italian banks lend to the Italian government. The Italian government uses that money to bail out Italian banks, and both become more interconnected and more fragile. If Italy's government debt loses value, Italian banks lose value. If Italian banks collapse, the Italian government must bail them out, which increases the debt, which lowers the value of Italian bonds, which weakens Italian banks further. This is the doom loop. And it is the reason why a crisis in Italian banks could trigger a sovereign debt crisis. And a sovereign debt crisis could trigger a banking crisis. The two are inseparable. Ticking bomb number 3, the demographic catastrophe. Italy's third ticking bomb is demographic, and it is the most certain and most irreversible of all. Italy's birth rate is 1.24 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. To maintain a stable population, a country needs a birth rate of 2.1. Italy is not even close, and the trend is getting worse, not better. Every year, more Italians die than are born. Italy's population is shrinking by over 200,000 people per year, and it is aging rapidly. By 2050, over 35% of Italians will be over the age of 65. Italy will have one of the oldest populations on Earth. The economic implications are catastrophic. Italy's pension system, like most European systems, is pay-as-you-go. Current workers pay for current retirees. It only works if there are enough workers. In 1950, there were 7 Italian workers for every retiree. Today, there are fewer than 2 workers per retiree. By 2050, the ratio will approach 1-to-1, one worker supporting one retiree. The mathematics are brutal. Pension spending already consumes over 15% of Italy's GDP, the highest in Europe. As the population ages, that percentage will rise, but the tax base will shrink. Fewer workers means less income tax revenue. Less consumption means less VAT revenue. The fiscal gap will widen every year, and there is no policy solution that changes this. You cannot force people to have children. Italy has tried. Generous parental leave, subsidies for families, tax breaks, none of it has worked. Because the decision to have children is not primarily economic, it is cultural. And in Italy, as in much of Europe, the culture has shifted. Young Italians are not having children, and those who want children are leaving Italy. Since 2008, over 500,000 young Italians have emigrated, mostly to Germany, the UK, and the United States. Italy is experiencing a brain drain. The educated, ambitious, skilled young people who could drive economic growth are leaving because Italy offers them no future. Youth unemployment in Italy runs above 20%, higher in the south. A university graduate in Italy faces years of temporary contracts, low wages, and no job security. Meanwhile, Germany, the UK, and the US offer better salaries, better opportunities, and functioning economies. Why stay? The result is that Italy is losing the exact people it needs to fund the pensions of the aging population. The demographic trap is closing, and there is no escape. Ticking bomb number 4, the political paralysis. Italy's fourth and perhaps most dangerous bomb is political. Because even if Italy's leaders understood the problems, even if they knew exactly what reforms were needed, the Italian political system is incapable of implementing them. Since World War II, Italy has had over 70 governments. 70. That is an average of one government every year. No other Western democracy comes close to this level of instability. Why? Because Italy's political system is designed for coalition governments. No party ever wins an outright majority. Every government is a coalition of multiple parties with different ideologies, different constituencies, and different priorities. These coalitions are fragile. They collapse constantly. And while they exist, they cannot make hard decisions. Because any difficult reform will cause one party to leave the coalition. And when one party leaves, the government falls. Italy needs pension reform. The pension system is unsustainable. Everyone knows it. But cutting pensions is political suicide. Retirees vote. And any government that cuts pensions will be replaced by one that promises to restore them. Italy needs labor market reform. Hiring and firing need to be easier. Businesses need flexibility. But labor unions are powerful. And any government that weakens labor protections will face strikes, protests, and electoral punishment. Italy needs to cut public spending. The deficit needs to shrink. But public spending employs millions of Italians. Cut spending and unemployment rises. Unemployment rises and the government loses support. Italy is trapped. The reforms it needs are politically impossible. And the political system that makes reform impossible cannot itself be reformed. Because changing the political system requires a constitutional amendment, which requires a supermajority, which requires consensus among parties that agree on nothing. Meanwhile, Italy is divided not just politically, but geographically. The north and the south of Italy are almost different countries. The north, centered on Milan and the industrial regions, is wealthy, productive, and integrated into European supply chains. The south, centered on Naples and Sicily, is poor, dependent on government transfers, and plagued by organized crime. Northern Italians resent subsidizing the south. Southern Italians resent northern arrogance and neglect. This divide has existed for over a century, and it is getting worse, not better. Political parties exploit the divide. The Northern League campaigns on northern grievances. Southern populists campaign on southern resentment, and no government can bridge the gap. Italy is not one nation with one economy, facing one set of problems. It is two regions with incompatible interests, forced into a single political system that satisfies neither, and locked into a currency, the euro, that fits neither. The result is paralysis. 70 governments in 70 years, and not one of them has solved Italy's structural problems, because the political system is designed to prevent solutions. So here is why Italy is different, and why Italy is the next disaster. Greece was small. When Greece collapsed, the Eurozone could contain it. Bailouts, austerity, pain, but the system survived. Italy is not small. Italy is the third largest economy in the Eurozone. If Italy's debt becomes unsustainable, if its banks collapse, if its government defaults, there is no rescue package large enough. The European Central Bank can buy time. It can purchase Italian bonds. It can provide liquidity to Italian banks. But it cannot solve structural problems. It cannot make Italians have more children. It cannot force Italian politicians to reform pensions. It cannot make the Italian economy competitive inside the euro. And it cannot bail out a country with $2.9 trillion in debt. Germany could, in theory, guarantee Italian debt. But Germany will not, because German voters will not accept it. And Germany itself is now facing economic contraction and cannot afford to be Europe's permanent backstop. France could help. But France is running its own deficits and facing its own fiscal crisis. Spain and the Netherlands have no capacity. The European Union as a whole does not have a fiscal mechanism large enough to save Italy. Italy is too big to bail, and too economically and politically important to let fail. That is the trap the Eurozone is in. And it is a trap with no exit. Here is the uncomfortable truth that European leaders refuse to admit. The euro was designed for an idealized Europe that does not exist. A Europe where economies were similar enough to share a currency, where fiscal discipline was maintained, where democratic accountability and economic necessity were aligned. That Europe never existed, and the gap between the dream and the reality is now destroying Italy. Italy needed its own currency, a currency that could devalue when Italy's economy struggled, a currency that could inflate away some of the debt burden, a currency that could adjust to Italy's productivity and wage levels. The euro took that tool away and gave Italy nothing in return except the privilege of borrowing at lower rates for 2 decades. Italy used those low rates to borrow more, not to reform, not to invest, but to delay the reckoning. That reckoning is here. The 4 bombs are ticking. The debt trap tightens every year. The banking system grows more fragile. The demographics worsen irreversibly, and the political system remains paralyzed. Italy will not explode tomorrow. This is not a sudden crisis. It is a slow-motion collapse, but the direction is set, and the mathematics are unforgiving. When the next recession arrives, when the ECB can no longer suppress Italian bond yields, when Italian banks require bailouts the government cannot afford, when the markets finally lose confidence, Italy will face a choice it cannot make: default and leave the euro, or accept austerity so severe it will make Greece look mild. Either choice destroys the European project, because if Italy leaves the euro, the currency union is finished. And if Italy stays and suffers, the political backlash will elect governments that leave anyway. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. Italy is the next disaster, not because Italians are lazy or incompetent, but because Italy is trapped in a